It was a warm Saturday. Morning in Maggie's diner was already filled with the smell of crispy bacon, hot coffee, and sweet maple syrup drifting through the air. The sunlight poured through, the big front windows painting, golden lines across the red, leather booths and shiny floor tiles. The place was alive with the gentle hum of chatter, the clinking of cups, and the sizzling. From the kitchen, the sound of laughter from a couple of regulars filled the air, making it feel like just another peaceful day in the little town diner. At the far corner, near the window, sat a small boy named Marcus. He was only 8 years old, with big, curious eyes and a smile that could melt anyone's heart. He wore a blue hoodie a little too big for him, and his sneakers had untied laces swinging back and forth as he sat on the stool. Marcus loved Maggie's diner. It was his favorite spot to have his special treat, a chocolate milkshake with extra whipped cream. His father, Mr. Johnson, had brought him here many times before, and today he had stopped by again before heading outside to take a quick phone call. Marcus sipped his milkshake. Humming quietly to himself, he was tracing shapes on the table with his finger lost in his own world. That was when a tall, broad man walked in. The bell above the door jingled, and the chatter in the diner seemed to fade for just a moment. It was Rick, the kind of man everyone in town knew about for all the wrong reasons. He was rough, loud, and always looking for someone smaller to push around. He sat down heavily on the stool near Marcus, grunting for the waitress to bring him a coffee. Marcus didn't pay much attention to him. He was too focused on balancing the cherry on top of his milkshake, trying not to let it fall. But as he reached for a napkin, his elbow bumped the glass slightly, and a few drops of milkshake splashed onto the floor near Rick's boots. Marcus gasped and quickly grabbed a bunch of napkins. "Oh no, I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to," he said in his small voice. Rick turned his head slowly, glaring down at the boy. His eyes were cold and mean. "Watch where you're going, kid," he growled. Marcus nodded frantically, still trying to wipe the floor, but Rick wasn't done. He stood up, towering over Marcus, and before anyone could stop him, he raised his hand and slapped the little boy across the face. The sound cracked through the diner like thunder, and in that single moment, the whole place fell silent. Every fork stopped. Midair, every voice went quiet, and all eyes turned to the man who had just hit a child. Marcus froze, his cheek stung red hot, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't cry. He couldn't. His little hands shook as he held onto the edge of the stool, staring at the man who had just hurt him. The air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rick leaned back, sneering. "That'll teach him some respect," he muttered to no one in particular. The waitress dropped her coffee pot, the glass shattering against the floor. Still no one moved. Outside the diner, Mr. Johnson ended his phone call completely, unaware of what had just happened. Inside, he started walking back toward the door, his steps calm and steady. The bell above the diner door was about to ring again, but this time it wouldn't be just another peaceful Sunday morning. The bell above the diner door jingled again, and every head turned as Mr. Johnson stepped back inside. His presence was calm but carried a quiet weight that made people notice. He wore a dark gray suit, his tie perfectly straight, and his shoes shining like mirrors. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be respected. The kind of silence that followed him wasn't loud or forced. It was the kind that demanded attention without asking for it. He looked around slowly, eyes moving from table to table until they landed on his son, Marcus. The little boy sat frozen on the stool, one hand still on his cheek, his milkshake knocked over and dripping onto the floor. Mr. Johnson's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened. The warmth in them faded, replaced by something cold and unreadable. He walked closer, every step steady and controlled. The people in the diner didn't know what to do. Some looked down, pretending not to see. Others watched with wide eyes. Afraid to breathe, Rick sat back in his seat, trying to act casual, but his hand was trembling just a little. He hadn't realized the boy's father was still nearby. Mr. Johnson knelt down in front of his son. "Marcus, what happened, son?" he asked. Quietly, his voice was soft, steady, like he was speaking to calm a storm. Marcus didn't speak right away. He looked up at his father, his lips trembling. Then he raised one small hand and pointed toward Rick. The room seemed to freeze again. The air felt heavy thick with tension. Rick shifted in his seat, his smirk fading a little. "Hey, look, man, it was just a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a laugh. The words sounded empty. The waitress near the counter bit her lip, whispering to the diner owner under her breath, "He doesn't know who he just messed with." Mr. Johnson stood up slowly, straightening his suit jacket. He looked at Rick for a long moment without speaking. The kind of stare that stripped away arrogance layer by layer until all that was left was fear. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, low, almost too quiet to hear. "Who did this?" he asked again, even though he already knew. No one answered but Marcus's pointing finger said enough. Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened for a second, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his gaze toward Rick and took one step forward. The diner had never felt so quiet. The sound of a ticking clock behind the counter suddenly seemed deafening as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The diner was so still you could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Mr. Johnson stood facing Rick, his eyes calm but sharp as glass. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. His quietness spoke louder than shouting ever could. He walked to the chair across from Rick and pulled it out slowly. The legs scraped against the floor in a long, chilling sound that made everyone flinch. He sat down, his movements controlled and deliberate, as if he were sitting down to discuss business, not to confront the man who had just slapped his son. Rick tried to keep his confidence. He leaned back in his seat, forcing a crooked grin, trying to act like none of this bothered him. "Yeah, what's up?" he said, with a smirk, trying to sound tough. "It's a free country, isn't it, mister?" Johnson didn't answer right away. He folded his hands on the table, his eyes fixed on Rick. "You make a habit of hitting children?" he asked softly. Rick scoffed like he didn't care. "Only the ones who don't watch where they're going," he muttered, with a shrug, but his voice cracked slightly. The waitress in the corner held her breath, her hands shaking as she poured coffee that no one wanted anymore. The air felt colder, somehow heavier. Mr. Johnson leaned back just a little, his eyes never leaving. "Rick, you think that makes you strong?" he said, calm but firm. Rick shrugged again, trying to hide his unease. "Stronger than some brat who spills drinks?" he said, chuckling nervously. His laugh fell flat. Mr. Johnson smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You know my boy," he said quietly. "He's got better manners than most grown men. He said sorry to you, but you still hit him. That doesn't make you strong. It makes you small." Rick opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry. He looked around, hoping someone would back him up. But no one dared. The people in the diner stayed still, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. Everyone could feel that something deeper was happening, something they didn't understand. The diner owner, Maggie, whispered to one of the waitresses, "Oh, dear Lord, he doesn't know who that man is." The waitress swallowed hard and whispered back, "That's Mr. Johnson, isn't it? The one they call Mr. J." The owner nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "Yeah, that's him." Rick frowned, noticing their whispers. "Who's Mr. J?" he asked, almost laughing. But his voice betrayed him. He was trying to sound fearless, but his hands were trembling slightly. Mr. Johnson didn't answer. He just tilted his head, slightly, his eyes unreadable. Then he spoke again, very softly. "I asked you a question earlier. Do you make a habit of hitting children?" Rick didn't respond this time. He just stared back, feeling something heavy in his chest for the first time in a long time, something that felt like fear. The air inside the diner was thick, like it was holding its breath. Mr. Johnson stayed seated across from Rick, his calmness turning every second into pressure. Rick shifted in his chair, trying to sit tall, but his shoulders felt heavy. Under the man's steady stare, he tried to laugh it off again, hoping to brush it aside. "Look, man, you really gonna make a big deal over a kid spilling some milkshake?" he said, his voice uneasy. Mr. Johnson smiled faintly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was slow, deliberate, the kind that made Rick's heart beat a little faster. "You see, my boy has manners," he said. "He apologized to you politely, but you decided to put your hands on him. That's not an accident. That's a choice." Rick looked away, muttering under his breath, "Yeah, whatever. Maybe teach him to be more careful next time." Mr. Johnson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You should be careful with how you talk," he said, his tone never rose, not once, but it hit harder than a shout, Rick looked around again, hoping someone would speak up. No one did. The customers kept their heads down, pretending to look at menus they weren't reading. Maggie stood frozen behind the counter, ringing, a towel in her hands. Her eyes darted between the two men. Rick scoffed. So what now, you gonna call the cops or something? Mr. Johnson's smile didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. No, he said quietly. Don't call the cops. I am the one people call when the cops can't help. Rick frowned, not understanding. What's that supposed to mean? At that exact moment, the bell over the door jingled again, and two tall men in black suits stepped inside. They didn't say a word. They just walked in, calmly scanning the room before. Standing behind Mr. Johnson, their faces were hard and serious, their presence enough to make everyone else shrink in their seats. Rick's confidence cracked. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Who are these guys? He asked, his voice quieter now. The diner was silent except for the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. Johnson glanced up at his men, then back at Rick. You should have thought about who you were talking to before you hit a child. Rick forced out a shaky laugh. Come on, you can't be serious, man. I didn't even know he was your kid. I was just teaching him a lesson, mister. Johnson tilted his head slightly. And now I'm going to teach you one, he said. Still calm, still polite, but there was something in his tone, something final that made the whole room feel colder. The two men behind him stayed, still like shadows waiting for a signal, and everyone in the diner knew that the situation had shifted completely. The diner was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the slow dripping of coffee from the broken pot. The tension felt alive, like the air itself was watching, waiting. Rick tried to swallow, but his throat felt tight. He looked at Mr. Johnson now, really seeing him for the first time. The perfect suit, the calm voice, the way people avoided meeting his eyes. All of it started to click together. The diner owner, Maggie, took a shaky step forward, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. Rick, she whispered, don't you realize who you're talking to? That's Anthony Johnson. The whole diner turned toward her in shock. She looked pale, like she had just seen a ghost. You know who they call him in this city, Mr. J. He runs the East Side, every business, every deal, every corner that stays quiet. It's because he allows it. Rick blinked, trying to process the words. His stomach dropped. He had heard the name before, whispered in bars and back alleys and on late night news stories, but he never thought he'd meet the man face to face. He stared at Mr. Johnson, his mouth half open. That's you, he stammered. You're him. Mr. Johnson didn't deny it. He simply looked at Rick with the same calm expression. I don't care much for names, he said, but yes, people call me that. Rick's mind raced. He suddenly remembered all the stories about the man sitting across from him, the one who never shouted, never made threats, but whose word carried more weight than any badge or law. He was the man no one crossed, not twice, and certainly not like this. Rick's smirk vanished completely. Sweat began to gather at the back of his neck. Hey, look, man, I didn't know he was your kid, all right? I didn't mean nothing by it. I just got mad for a second. I'm sorry, okay? He tried to sound casual, but his voice cracked halfway through. Mr. Johnson leaned forward just a bit, resting his hands together on the table. You shouldn't have to know who someone's father is to treat a child with respect, he said, his voice even softer now, but heavier somehow. The words sank into the silence like stones in deep water. Rick's breathing grew faster, his heart pounding loud in his ears. Mr. Johnson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment, deep and cold. He looked at Rick for a long, quiet moment, then said, you hit my son because you thought no one would stop you, because you thought you were bigger, stronger, more important. Rick opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could feel everyone in the diner watching him, no one daring to speak. Mr. Johnson finally stood, his movements smooth, measured. He adjusted his cufflinks and looked down at Rick. You made a choice, he said softly, and now you're going to live with the consequences. Rick sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as fear crept through him for the first time in years. Mr. Johnson stood tall, his shadow stretching across the table, his voice still low but carrying a weight that made everyone listen. He looked down at Rick, who now sat frozen, eyes wide, breathing shallow. The room was so quiet that even the hum of the lights sounded loud. Mr. Johnson didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply spoke, each word slowly, clearly, like he was teaching a lesson that would never be forgotten. He turned to his son, Marcus, who was still sitting quietly on the stool, watching everything unfold. Son, he said gently, what do we do when someone hurts us? Marcus hesitated, his little hands fidgeting in his lap. Then he whispered, we forgive them, Dad, but we don't forget. Mr. Johnson nodded, slowly his expression softening for the first time. That's right, son. He turned his gaze back to Rick, his calmness returning, but with a different kind of strength. My son will forgive you, he said, but I won't forget. You're going to make this right? Rick blinked. Make it right. How? What do you want from me? Mr. Johnson leaned forward slightly. You're going to help rebuild what you, broke Maggie here, has been needing help with repairs and deliveries. You'll work for her every day, no pay, until I say you're done. Rick's mouth fell open. He looked from Mr. Johnson to Maggie, who was standing behind the counter, clutching a towel to her chest. Me, he stammered. You mean work here like a job? Mr. Johnson's eyes didn't move. Work is good for the soul, he said. It teaches respect. You'll start tomorrow. Rick shook his head, disbelief mixing with fear. What if I refuse? He asked, his voice trembling before he could stop himself. One of the men in black, standing behind Mr. Johnson, took a single step forward, cracking his knuckles slowly. The sound echoed through the diner. Rick froze, his heart pounding fast. Mr. Johnson didn't even look back at his men. He just kept his eyes on Rick. I'm not asking, he said quietly. I'm telling. Rick swallowed hard and nodded quickly. Okay, I'll do it. I'll show up. I promise. Mr. Johnson finally smiled again. But it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of closure. Good, he said. That's how you begin to fix what's been broken. Marcus watched his father, then looked at Rick. His small voice broke the silence. Again, it's okay, he said. Softly, just don't do that to anyone else ever again, Rick. Couldn't meet his eyes. He just nodded. Ashamed, Mr. Johnson placed a hand on his son's shoulder and turned to leave the two men in black, followed behind him as he said one last thing over his shoulder. Change isn't easy, Rick, but it starts the moment you choose to be better. Then the bell above. The door jingled softly as they stepped outside, leaving behind a room filled with silence and the weight of a lesson that would linger long after they were gone. Days turned into weeks, and every morning, Rick showed up at Maggie's diner just like Mr. Johnson had told him to. Came early before the place opened, wearing the same old work boots and a plain gray shirt, mopped the floors, cleaned the tables, fixed the leaky pipes, and carried heavy boxes from the delivery truck to the kitchen. At first, he did it because he was scared. He worked in silence, barely looking at anyone. His face stayed hard, his voice quiet, but deep down something was starting to change. The customers noticed it too. The man who once sat at the counter barking orders and making trouble was now wiping windows and holding doors open for strangers. Maggie watched him carefully, at first expecting him to snap or quit, but he never did. She began to nod at him in quiet approval each day when he clocked in. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One afternoon, as Rick was scrubbing the counter, Marcus walked in, holding his father's hand. The boy was smiling, bright and full of life. Again, he climbed onto his favorite stool and ordered his usual chocolate milkshake with extra whipped cream. Maggie made it herself, setting it in front of him with a kind smile. Rick froze for a second when he saw the boy. He didn't know what to say or even how to look him in the eyes. Marcus turned to him after a moment, his voice gentle. You're doing a good job, he said simply. Rick blinked. Taken off guard, he looked down at the little boy, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something warm in his chest. Thanks, kid, he said quietly. That means a lot. From that day on, Rick changed even more. He started smiling a little more often, saying good morning to the regulars, helping Maggie without being asked. He even paid for Marcus's milkshake a few times out of his own pocket, saying it was his way of making things right. The people in the diner began to treat him differently, too. They no longer whispered about what he had done. They just saw a man trying to fix his mistakes. Sometimes when the diner got quiet, Rick would glance toward the door, half expecting to see Mr. Johnson walk in again. The thought made him work harder, not out of fear anymore, but out of respect. He wanted to prove that the lesson he had been given had meant something he didn't. just want to escape his past. He wanted to be better than it, and every day that passed inside that small diner helped him take another step toward becoming a different man. Months passed, and the change in Rick became impossible. To ignore Maggie's diner looked brighter than ever. The walls were freshly painted, the floors gleamed like new, and even the old neon sign outside buzzed proudly again. But the biggest change wasn't in the diner. It was in Rick himself. The rough, angry man who had once walked in with a chip on his shoulder was gone. In his place stood someone quieter, humbler, stronger in a different way. One cool afternoon, the bell above the door jingled softly, and Mr. Johnson walked in again. Marcus followed, close behind, holding a small paper bag from the bakery. Rick looked up from the counter, where he was polishing a row of glasses. His breath caught in his throat for a second, but then he stood straight, wiped his hands, and nodded respectfully. "Good afternoon." Sir Mr. Johnson gave a slow, approving nod as he took a seat at the same booth where it had all started. Marcus slid in beside him, smiling brightly. "You've done well," Mr. Johnson said calmly, glancing around the spotless diner. Maggie stood nearby, watching the moment with quiet pride. Rick shifted nervously, rubbing his hands together. "Thank you." "Sir, I just did what you asked." Mr. Johnson studied him for a long moment. "You did. More than that," he said. "You changed. That's something no one can force you to do." Rick looked down, eyes glistening slightly. "I just didn't want to be that man anymore." Marcus reached into his paper bag, pulled out a small chocolate muffin, and handed it to Rick. "My dad says when someone changes for real, they deserve a second chance," he said with his usual innocent grin. Rick took the muffin carefully, smiling for the first time in front of both of them. "Thank you, Marcus," he said softly. "I'll keep trying every day." Mr. Johnson stood and placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "Good men aren't born, Rick. They're made by their choices. Remember that?" Then he turned to leave. Marcus waved one last time before following his father out the door. Rick stood there for a long moment, holding the muffin in his hand. A few of the regulars started clapping quietly. Maggie smiled from behind the counter, her eyes misty as she whispered under her breath, "That's what real change looks like." From that day forward, Maggie's Diner became more than just a place to eat. It became a place where people remembered that strength isn't shown by fear, but through forgiveness and the courage to start over. Narrator voice calm and heartfelt. And that's how one act of kindness turned a moment of anger into a story of redemption. Forgive but never forget. Respect everyone no matter who they are, because you never know what battle they're fighting or who stands behind them. Fade to black screen with white text. Like, subscribe, and share for more powerful life stories.